Hello, and welcome to the Sales Director Podcast, the show that gives you sales director level insight and strategy every single week. Now, I'm your host, Jerry. I've been in sales for 23 odd years. And for the last 5 years, I've been running a head of sales, which is a consultancy that provides growing business with sales director level insight and support without the need for a full time hire. Now, in the time I've been running my business and across my years in sales, I've worked with so many different businesses of so many different sizes and in so many different industries. So there's not many things that I've not seen and not many mistakes that I've made. And I'm going to use that experience. And in each episode, we're going to explore the mistakes that other businesses make, often year on year, when it comes to sales. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my advice, my experience, my expertise, and my best practice tips so that you don't have to make the same mistakes that I have in the past. So let's get into it. So this week, we're going to be talking about what I call the silver bullet syndrome. And this is when businesses reach for a singular solution to a sales issue they've got. Um, and it usually takes three different forms. Two of those forms are the early silver bullet, so it's doing something a little bit too early. And the other one is the too late silver bullet. So when they come to a sales solution a little bit too late. So I'm going to talk through each of these in turn, explain them, and then discuss how you might look to see if you might have a sales issue that needs solving. So the early silver bullet. So the first mistake that people make with the early silver bullet is that they hire an outbound seller for their business. Um, and this might come around when the founder or the owner or the management team, um, they maybe don't come from a sales background themselves. So they might be technical experts, it might be a software developer, etc. And they say to themselves, oh, I've got a great product here, but I can't sell. So I'm going to get somebody that can sell in to sell my product. Now, the issue with this is that quite often they've not proven the concept. They've not sold anything themselves. It might be too early stage. They've not had any buyers. And therefore, what they're expecting is somebody on a relatively low salary to be able to sell their product or service really, really effectively, despite the fact that no collateral, no support, no process has been created for them to follow. So they're almost expecting a strategic level hire for an entry level sales resource. And frankly, it's just not fair. It's not fair on that poor seller that they hire. And I see this over and over and over again. I see it all the time. People hire this seller thinking this seller is going to really smash their sales out of the water. When in reality, that poor person has been set up to fail. Um, so if you want to hire a seller, what you really need to do is actually look internally and say, have I sold this before? Have I even created a basic process? Do I know the target audience that I want to be selling to? Do I know how my product fits into that target audience? These are all the questions you should be asking yourself before you actually think about hiring an outbound seller. And for most founders, they need to try and sell something themselves. If you become a founder, you are by de facto a salesperson. And it's about time you got used to that. And hiring an entry level salesperson is just not the right shout. You're setting themselves up to fail. You're going to be wasting money on a salary. It might not be that much, but you're wasting money on a salary with somebody that, unless they're really brainy or really ambitious, um, just doesn't have the experience in order to be set up the processes, the mechanisms, and everything like that that is needed to sell successfully. Now, this takes me on to the early silver bullet problem, but in a different way. The other attack that founders or owners or management teams often take is that instead of doing the early stage hire, they instead decide that they're going to invest, 80, 100, 120 grand on a basic salary for a really experienced, really high level sales director. Now, this this strategy has its merits. And I can understand it because often these businesses don't have a strategy in place whatsoever. They may not even know what their target verticals are. They may not even have a commercial model. So they think, oh, well, we'll bring in this really senior hire. They can create all that, but then they can also sell for us. Um, and this is the real problem. Now, when you're hiring a sales director at that level of salary, that's somebody with a decent amount of skin in the game. And that somebody has managed to grow themselves from being a frontline seller into being a much more strategic level resource. Um, and frankly, when you get to that level, your interest, you've done too much selling on the phones. You've done your time um, at that level. You've done your time bashing the phones, doing high activity, living really precariously. Your day is only as good as the sales you're making on that day. It's a really tough gig, and most sales directors they're just too far past that. So what happens in businesses when they actually get this level of resource on is that they get a really solid strategy built. They get, a really solid playbook built. They get all the resources, all the collateral, the processes created. But what they don't get is somebody that actually wants to get on and sell. And what that business needs is sales. Now, they do need the process. Going back to what I said previously, they do need that collateral to be built, but they also need the sales coming through the door. And this is what I mean by silver bullet. In this case, they're thinking that the sales director is going to solve all their problems. But at the early stage silver bullet, what you really need is a mix of solutions. You need the strategic level insight, and you need the person that's willing to get on the phone, willing to send the emails, willing to spend the time on LinkedIn prospecting, willing to go out and do networking, willing to do whatever it takes to bring sales in. And you don't get that hunger with a sales director. And an entry level salesperson doesn't have the experience to be able to create the stuff in the background that makes sales work. So, what should you do? So, if you're a type of business that has the resource to invest, say, 100 grand in a sales director, a strategic level sales resource, don't. Instead, invest some of that money into frontline sellers. Okay, so let's say you've got 120 grand. You could theoretically get three sellers on a 40 grand base salary. That's enough for them to live on while they're still waiting for their pipeline to build and for those first sales to come in. But I would suggest maybe hire two. Two is maybe a bit less risky and it doesn't max out your budget. On top of that, you don't need to be investing in a full-time sales director resource. You can get somebody in part-time on a contractual basis, on a fractional basis, and they can come in and build your strategy in the background without that massive full-time salary. And with that, that's almost like the perfect approach because you're getting the strategy built, the playbooks built, process built, the training, the coaching, the onboarding, the interviewing, all of that stuff is created in the background with your sort of part-time resource. And then you're getting early stage sellers who have the hunger to actually do the activity to make the sales. But the key difference is that those early stage sellers are actually supported. They've got all the mechanisms, they've got the stuff to fall back on that will support them in their daily endeavors to make sales. So this is what I mean by the silver bullet. There is no, at an early stage, there is no single silver bullet in order to grow sales. Generally, it's a mixed approach that ensures a successful sales function is created from the outset. So I'd really encourage you to look at your options, look at where you are. Have you sold? Because if you've not sold anything yourself, then you need to sell yourself in order to prove the concept. And then if you have sold and you need to take that sales growth to the next level, invest your money wisely. Get somebody who's going to do the activity, but then also get some support for that person. Doing it on its own is not really going to work for you, and it could be a real waste of money. Now, let's look at it from the other end, and this is the late silver bullet. I often call it the 2 years too late silver bullet. Um, Now, what actually often happens in a business is that they sort of grow organically. They almost grow by happenstance. So maybe they were in the market at the right time and they just benefited from being the only person in the market that offered that solution. And so they grew um, until suddenly they didn't. What often then happens is that something comes to a crunch point. The business stops growing, or they grow much more slowly, or they realize that actually their stability is based on renewals, but they don't have much new business coming in. And usually they have this realization a lot earlier than they actually start to seek support. Um, so they kind of know it's happening, but they're resistant to change anything. Maybe the way their business has grown, it's become a bit more like a family type business. They're worried about upsetting people or whatever it might be, but they just sort of bide their time. They sort of sit and they watch and they see what's going to happen. And then, lo and behold, 2 years down the line, things are way worse than they even were when they first realized this problem. And what they then do is they engage in sales support, whether that's hiring some sort of seller, whether that's getting external sales support, whatever it might be. They suddenly realize, oh my God, we need to sort out, we need to get new business through the door. Let's get some form of seller in. Um, and this is I see this all the time. I've engaged with several clients that have brought me in far too late. Um, and the pressure is unreal. Um, Now, the reason it's too late is certainly proactive sales. It takes a long time for that to get up and running. Even the most basic type of sale, it can take 3 months to make the first sale. Any seller, some sellers might make sales in their first month. Generally, that's just luck. It's not out of any sort of judgment. A proactive outbound sales program takes months and months to build. So if you've waited till the last possible moment to actually engage in any sort of sales support, whether you're hiring a sales resource or whatever that might be, generally that's way too late because that sales resource probably needs about a year's runway in order to start making meaningful benefit to the business. And generally, by that point, the business has got some real immediate concerns that they need to solve, or their business may not actually be succeeding anymore. And the pressure you're actually putting on that seller to basically solve all of the problems that you could have solved 2 years earlier is really massively unfair for that seller. And that desperation that you've got puts massive pressure on that seller. So there's no real magic answer to this. Um, uh, I guess the only thing that I would say is the moment you think that sales might be in trouble is probably when you should actually engage some sort of sales support, maybe seek to hire a seller or whatever that might be, because the chances are you're 2 years before, or maybe even a year before the business potentially running out of steam. Um, you might be sitting there now. You might be thinking, "Oh, sales doesn't seem to be going as well as it once was, but I'm not really sure if I need support now." Now, the first thing I would say is that gut feeling is telling you something. But if you want to add some concrete evidence to that gut feeling, here's what I suggest you do. First of all, look at where your business is coming from. If you're getting tons of inbound marketing and you're able to measure the results that you're going to get from that inbound marketing based on your investment, then that's absolutely fine. If your business is if your new business is not actually covering the amount of business that you churn every year, then you've got a sales problem. So look into that. The other thing is to look at your sales pipeline. Um, Now, your pipeline is basically your business fortune teller. It tells you how much business is going to close in X period, maybe the next 6 months, maybe the next year. Now, when you've been in sales for a while, you understand the concept of pipeline coverage. What that means is, like what I said earlier in the episode, the inputs guarantee the outputs. Now, let's say your sales target is £50,000. What you're going to need in your pipeline to guarantee that £50,000 is at least £150,000. So, what I mean by that is 3 times your sales target in your actual pipeline. So I would suggest you to have a deep dive into your pipeline. Get rid of all the stuff that is never going to close. So get rid of things like tenders because you've got no control over tenders really. Get rid of all the stuff that you've not really got, real control over, and then look at your pipeline. And if it's anything less than 3 times, then again you've got a sales problem. Now, where that sales problem lies in that pipeline is a whole different episode that I'm not going to get into right now. But the bare bones of it, or the two things that I think you should be looking at, is if your new business isn't covering the amount of business that you lose every year, then you've got a sales problem, and you should be engaging in some sort of sales support or sales investment. Or if your pipeline coverage is not going to guarantee your sales target, or potentially even guarantee a growth in sales, then you've also got a sales problem. So go away and have a look at that. If you've got a gut instinct that your sales maybe isn't in the place where you need it to be, those would be the two things I would look at initially. The thread through all of it is that essentially there's no silver bullet. Um, Generally, there's a mixture of different things, and no singular resource is going to solve all of your issues. That resource has to come at the right time. It's got to be the right resource, and there has to be the mechanics underneath it in order to help that resource succeed. Ultimately it's structure and it's time, and you've got to give sales time to be successful for you. So this week, pick one of the three that you think is most relevant to you, and maybe investigate that. Maybe look at that. You don't need to fix it necessarily, just notice it, and then you can make a plan. Noticing it is half the step, and then you can make the plan. So, anyway, I'm Jerry. I'm your host. This has been the Sales Director Podcast, and I'll see you next week.